The Grand Diplomatic Chamber of the Stellar Empire's flagship Eternal Dawn buzzed with activity. Representatives from 20 different species moved about, their voices a mix of clicks, whistles, and spoken words. Among them stood James Miller, a human diplomatic officer who had only joined the court 6 months ago. James straightened his navy blue uniform, trying to look confident despite feeling overwhelmed. The chamber itself was impressive, towering crystal walls that seemed to catch and multiply the starlight from outside, creating patterns that danced across the floor. He was here as part of Earth's first major trade negotiation with the Stellar Empire. Remember, his superior had warned him that morning, "Keep your head down and stay quiet. You're here to observe and learn." The room suddenly fell silent. Through the main doors entered Admiral Nova, the infamous military commander of the Stellar Empire. Her reputation preceded her: destroyer of fleets, conqueror of systems, and, according to some, the most feared being in 3 sectors of space. James couldn't help but stare. She wasn't what he expected. Instead of the monster from the stories, he saw a tall, elegant figure. Her skin had a subtle metallic sheen, like polished copper in twilight. 4 arms moved with precise grace, each finger tipped with what looked like natural armor. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. They were like captured nebulae, swirling with colors he had no names for. And then it happened. As Admiral Nova swept her gaze across the room, she locked eyes with James. He meant to look away, really he did, but something in those cosmic eyes held him. 1 second stretched into 2, then 3, and finally 5 full seconds of direct eye contact. The silence in the room deepened into something absolute. A glass dropped somewhere, shattering against the floor. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held James, and he finally looked away. When he glanced back up, he saw every alien in the room staring at him, with expressions that ranged from shock to horror to what he thought might be pity. Admiral Nova had gone completely still. An older diplomatic officer, Tom, grabbed James's arm so hard it hurt. "What have you done?" he whispered, his face pale. I just looked at her," James said, confusion clear in his voice. "In their culture, sustained eye contact is—" Tom swallowed hard. "It's a formal proposal of marriage. And you just proposed to the most dangerous woman in the Stellar Empire." James felt his stomach drop. "That's not possible. There has to be some way to explain that it was a mistake. Their species doesn't believe in accidents when it comes to such matters," Tom explained, his voice shaking. "They believe the soul chooses, even when the mind isn't aware. And refusing such a proposal is considered one of the gravest insults possible in their culture." Admiral Nova finally moved. She walked directly toward James, her steps measured and precise. The crowd parted before her like water. When she stopped in front of him, James realized she was nearly 2 feet taller than him. She spoke, her voice carrying a musical quality that human vocal cords could never reproduce. The translator in James's ear converted her words. "You are either the bravest or the most foolish human I have ever encountered." James opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure what to say. "I accept your proposal," she continued, causing another wave of gasps throughout the chamber. "It has been 3 centuries since anyone dared to look me in the eyes for more than a moment. You have intrigued me." As James stood there, trying to process how his routine diplomatic observation mission had turned into an accidental engagement to the most feared military commander in known space, he had one clear thought. His next performance review was going to be very interesting indeed. Tom leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Congratulations. You're about to become the first human to marry into the Stellar Empire's highest military ranks. Try not to do anything else accidentally diplomatic today, okay?" James could only nod, his eyes carefully fixed on the floor as he wondered how he was going to explain this to his parents back on Earth. The next 24 hours aboard the Eternal Dawn were pure chaos. James found himself confined to a luxurious diplomatic suite, while both human and Stellar Empire officials scrambled to handle the situation. Through the suite's large window, he watched distant stars drift by, trying to make sense of how his life had changed so dramatically. The door chimed frequently as various officials came and went, each bringing more complicated news than the last. "This is either a diplomatic disaster or a miracle," said Director Wells, the head of Earth's diplomatic corps, pacing the room. She hadn't slept since the incident, and it showed. "Do you understand what position you've put us in?" Before James could answer, his room's communication screen lit up. The stern face of Admiral Nova appeared, causing Director Wells to straighten her posture immediately. "I wish to speak with my intended," Admiral Nova announced. Even through the screen, her nebula-like eyes seemed to glow. Director Wells cleared her throat. "Of course, Admiral. We were just discussing the unique situation." "There is nothing to discuss. The proposal was made and accepted according to our laws. The Union will proceed." Admiral Nova's tone left no room for argument. James found his voice. "But surely there must be some way to explain that in human culture, eye contact doesn't mean. Are you attempting to withdraw your proposal?" Admiral Nova's voice dropped several octaves, making the room's temperature seem to plummet. Director Wells jumped in quickly. No, of course not. James is simply trying to understand your customs better." "Right, James?" James caught the warning look in his superior's eyes. "Yes, exactly that." A different official rushed into the room, holding a datapad. "Director, we've received intelligence about the situation. According to our sources, Admiral Nova has turned down 847 potential mates in the last 3 centuries. She's destroyed 15 warships for what she considered inappropriate courtship attempts." James felt his mouth go dry. "That is correct," Admiral Nova said from the screen, a hint of pride in her voice. "Your James is the first to catch my interest. His directness is refreshing." Director Wells grabbed the datapad, scanning it quickly. "It says here that marriages between Stellar Empire military leaders and foreign diplomats automatically create binding military alliances." "Indeed," Admiral Nova confirmed. "Once our union is complete, Earth will gain the protection of my fleet. All 17,000 ships." The room went silent as the implications sank in. Earth had been trying to secure a military alliance with the Stellar Empire for years, without success. 17,000 ships, James repeated weakly. "The largest fleet in 3 sectors." Admiral Nova said, something almost like a smile crossing her metallic features. "I look forward to showing them to you, intended." After the communication ended, Director Wells collapsed into a chair. 17,000 ships. With that kind of protection, Earth's position in the galaxy would be secured for generations. "So I have to go through with this?" James asked. "Have to. James, you're about to become a hero of Earth. This accidental proposal of yours might have just accomplished what years of careful diplomacy couldn't." She paused, looking at him carefully. "Unless you have serious objections." James thought about Admiral Nova, her commanding presence, her direct manner, and those fascinating eyes. "No, not serious objections, just normal terror about marrying the most feared military commander in known space." "Good man," Director Wells said, patting his shoulder. "The marriage preparation team will arrive tomorrow. You'll need to learn Stellar Empire customs, their language, their marriage rituals. How long do I have?" "The traditional courtship period is 1 Earth month." James nodded slowly, trying to look more confident than he felt. As he turned back to the window, he saw a fleet of Stellar Empire ships emerge from faster-than-light travel, their hulls gleaming in the starlight. His future wife's army, he realized. The door chimed again. This time, it was a cultural advisor carrying what looked like a very thick book, titled Stellar Empire Marriage Customs and Traditions. "Shall we begin?" the advisor asked cheerfully. James took a deep breath. 1 month to learn how to be a suitable husband for the galaxy's most powerful military commander. No pressure at all. The observation deck of the Eternal Dawn was empty except for James and Admiral Nova. It was their first official courtship meeting, and James couldn't help but notice how the starlight played across her metallic skin. "You're still nervous," Nova stated, her forearms clasped behind her back as she gazed out at the stars. "Your heart rate increases by 23% whenever I enter a room." James smiled despite his anxiety. "You can hear my heartbeat. My species evolved as apex predators. We can detect many things others cannot." She turned those nebula eyes toward him. "Does this frighten you?" "Honestly, less than it probably should." James moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain proper distance as his cultural training had taught him. "I'm more curious than scared." Nova tilted her head. A gesture he'd learned indicated interest. "Curious about what?" "Everything. For instance, why did you accept my accidental proposal? You've turned down hundreds of others." 847 others, she corrected. "And they all approached me with fear. Their proposals were based on political advantage or ambition. You," she paused, considering her words. "You looked at me as a person, not a legend." James hadn't expected such honesty. "I didn't know who you were at first." "Exactly." Nova's lower set of arms moved in what he now recognized as an expression of amusement. "You saw me before you saw Admiral Nova, destroyer of fleets." "About that title," James ventured. "Is it true you destroyed an entire battle group because they insulted your honor?" Nova made a sound that took James a moment to recognize as laughter. "Is that what they say? I disabled their weapons systems and left them floating in space for 6 hours. Sometimes reputation is more effective than actual violence." James found himself relaxing. "So you're not as terrifying as everyone thinks." "Oh, I am exactly as terrifying as they think," Nova replied, but there was warmth in her voice. "I simply choose when to be terrifying. It's a useful tool in maintaining peace." "Peace through strength." "Peace through the threat of strength," she corrected. "The best battles are the ones you win without fighting." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching a distant comet pass by. James noticed that Nova kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. "You have questions too," he said. "Many. Your species is puzzling. You're physically weaker than most spacefaring races, yet you've managed to establish yourselves as a significant power. You lack natural defenses, enhanced senses, or significant technological advantages. Yet here you are." "We're adaptable," James offered. "And stubborn. Very stubborn." "Yes, I've noticed." Nova's upper right hand moved to her chest, touching a symbol on her uniform. "Your diplomatic corps has been trying to secure an alliance with us for years, never once backing down despite repeated rejections. And now you're going to give us that alliance because I couldn't keep my eyes to myself. The universe works in strange ways, does it not?" There was definitely amusement in her voice now. "Though I should warn you, my family will want to test you." James felt his newfound comfort waver slightly. "Test me how?" "Nothing too severe. Just the traditional challenges, combat trials, strategic puzzles, survival tests." She noticed his expression. "Don't worry. I've already calculated your chances of survival at 73.8%. That's reassuring." Nova's all four hands moved in what his training identified as a gesture of affection. "You'll do fine. You've already passed the hardest test. You can talk to me without shaking in fear." As they continued their conversation, James realized something surprising. He was actually enjoying himself. Yes, his future wife could probably break him in half without trying. And yes, her family might accidentally kill him with their tests. But there was something captivating about her directness and dry humor. "Your heart rate has normalized," Nova observed. "Good. Perhaps next time we can discuss your planet's defensive capabilities without you fearing I'm planning an invasion." "Were you?" "Of course not. I already have a much more efficient plan for acquiring Earth's resources." She paused. "That was a joke. Your cultural advisors said I should practice those. James laughed, genuinely this time. Maybe this arranged marriage wouldn't be so terrifying after all. The marriage preparation chamber aboard the Eternal Dawn looked like a cross between a military briefing room and a wedding planner's office. Holographic displays showed both wedding ceremonies and battle formations, while cultural advisors from both species hurried about with stacks of data pads. James stood in the center of the room, attempting to master a traditional Stellar Empire marriage gesture that involved coordinating movements he wasn't even sure human joints could perform. No, his instructor, an elderly member of Nova's species named Eldervale, sighed. Your arms must flow like cosmic winds, not flap like a wounded bird. I only have 2 arms, James reminded him gently. The traditional movements were designed for 4. Excuses won't impress the High Council, Eldervale grumbled. Again. On the other side of the room, Admiral Nova was having her own cultural lesson about human marriage customs. She sat rigidly in a chair that seemed too small for her impressive frame, watching videos of Earth weddings with increasing confusion. You mean to tell me, she said to her human instructor, that couples exchange small metal circles and speak words of devotion. And that's it. No combat trials. No strategic challenges. No tests of worthiness. Well, some couples do write their own vows, the instructor offered helpfully. Nova's nebula eyes narrowed. And this honeymoon concept, you just go somewhere pleasant and do nothing productive for days. It's meant to be romantic, the instructor explained. Romantic. Nova tested the word like it was a new form of weaponry she didn't quite trust. She turned to James. Intended, explain this concept of romance to me again. James paused in his arm-flailing attempts. It's about creating emotional connections through shared experiences and gestures of affection. We have something similar, Nova said thoughtfully. Though our gestures of affection typically involve conquering star systems for our mates. The human instructor dropped her datapad. That was another joke, Nova added quickly, then turned to James. Was that one better? Getting there, he smiled. Though maybe we should stick to smaller gestures. Flowers, perhaps, instead of conquered star systems. Nova considered this. Flowers die. A conquered star system is eternal. How about we compromise? James suggested. You can show me your battle strategies, and I'll teach you about Earth's customs for showing affection. Acceptable, Nova agreed, though I still don't understand why humans press their mouths together to show affection. It seems terribly inefficient. Kissing. James felt his face heat up. It's called kissing. Yes, that. Your species has such soft defenses. Pressing them against another seems tactically unsound. The cultural advisors from both sides watched this exchange with a mixture of horror and fascination. Nobody had ever heard Admiral Nova discuss kissing before. Several of them made notes. Perhaps, Eldervale interrupted, we should return to the ceremony preparations. Admiral, you must practice the traditional roar of commitment. Nova stood, her impressive height making everyone else step back instinctively. She opened her mouth and released a sound that made the room's crystal decorations vibrate dangerously. Very good, Eldervale nodded. Now, James, you must respond with the cry of acceptance. James tried his best, but his human vocal cords produced something closer to an awkward yell than the required roar. We'll work on that, Nova said kindly, though perhaps we could incorporate some human traditions as well. These wedding vows intrigue me. The idea of publicly declaring one's intentions without any threat of violence is novel. The next few hours passed in a blur of cultural exchange. James learned that in Stellar Empire weddings, the couple traditionally fought their way through a corridor of warriors to reach the ceremony chamber. Nova learned that human weddings often involved dancing, though she seemed skeptical about any celebration that didn't include at least one ritual combat. By the end of the day, they had managed to create a ceremony that would hopefully satisfy both cultures, complete with both traditional roars and gentle vows, ritual combat, and wedding rings, strategic challenges, and romantic gestures. Your heart rate is elevated again, Nova observed as they finished. Wedding planning is stressful in any culture, James replied. Indeed. Shall we go destroy something to relieve the tension? How about we try that Earth stress relief technique I told you about? Deep breathing. Nova sighed. If we must. But tomorrow, I teach you proper battle meditation. The cultural advisors watched them leave, shaking their heads in amazement. Somehow, against all odds, this strange pair seemed to be making it work. The Grand Council chamber of the Eternal Dawn erupted into chaos. Admiral Vex, commander of the Empire's Third Fleet, stood from his seat, his metallic scales flashing with anger. This marriage cannot be allowed, he thundered. A human. In the High Command. It's an insult to our traditions. James watched from his designated spot beside Nova, trying to maintain a calm expression despite the growing tension. The chamber was filled with the Empire's highest-ranking officers, most of whom were staring at him like he was something they'd found stuck to their boot. Nova remained perfectly still, but James had learned to recognize the subtle signs of her anger. The slight bristling of her scales, the faint glow in her nebula eyes. Are you challenging my choice of mate, Admiral Vex? Her voice was deadly quiet. I challenge the human, Vex declared, pointing one of his 4 arms at James. Let him prove his worth in combat, as our laws allow. The chamber went silent. James felt his stomach drop. He'd been warned this might happen, but hoping it wouldn't. I accept your challenge, James said before Nova could intervene. His cultural training had prepared him for this moment. Refusing would be worse than losing. Nova turned to him, speaking quietly. You don't have to do this. I can. I do have to, James interrupted gently. We both know that. Admiral Vex's laughter boomed through the chamber. The combat ring. 1 hour. Unless the human wishes to withdraw. I'll be there, James replied, keeping his voice steady. After the council dispersed, Nova pulled James into a private chamber. You realize he's won 73 ritual combats. He's killed 26 challengers. I know, but I also know something he doesn't. Nova tilted her head. What's that? I've been studying Stellar Empire combat laws since our engagement began. There's nothing in the rules that says I have to fight him the way he expects. For the next hour, James prepared. He didn't go to the training rooms or practice with weapons. Instead, he sat with a data pad, reading and making notes. The combat ring was a circular platform suspended over a deep pit. Hundreds of spectators filled the surrounding stands, eager to see the human either prove himself or die trying. Admiral Vex entered first, his ceremonial armor gleaming. He carried traditional weapons in each of his 4 hands: energy blade, plasma whip, gravity mace, and neural disruptor. James walked in wearing his standard diplomatic uniform, carrying nothing. No weapons, Vex mocked. Do you plan to die that easily? James smiled. Actually, I invoked the right of alternative challenge under Code 47 of the combat laws. The crowd went silent. Even Vex looked startled. Instead of physical combat, James continued, I challenge you to a test of strategic command. A battle simulation with our ships and crews. Unless you're afraid to face me in your actual area of expertise. Nova, watching from the high command platform, made that sound James now recognized as surprised laughter. Vex couldn't refuse without losing face. The combat ring transformed into a holographic command center, displaying 2 fleets in position for battle. What followed was 3 hours of intense strategic warfare. James had spent weeks studying Nova's battle tactics, learning from the best commander in the Empire. He didn't try to match Vex's aggression. Instead, he used diplomacy, convincing 2 neutral forces in the simulation to ally with him, then outmaneuvered Vex's superior numbers with clever tactics. When the simulation ended, Vex's fleet was scattered, trapped between James's smaller force and his diplomatic allies. "The human wins," the combat judge announced. Vex stood rigid with shock. This isn't traditional combat." "No," Nova said, stepping down to the platform. "It was smarter. He proved himself worthy not through brute force, but through intelligence and understanding of our ways." She turned to the crowd. "Does anyone else wish to challenge my choice?" The silence was answer enough. Later, in private, Nova turned to James. "You studied our combat laws just to find that loophole." "I studied everything about your culture," James replied, "because I wanted to prove I take this seriously. All of it." Nova's forearms moved in that gesture of affection he'd grown to recognize. "Perhaps," she said, "you're not the only one who underestimated humans." Deep in the diplomatic wing of the Eternal Dawn, James sat reviewing security reports when Nova entered the room with unusual urgency in her movements. "We have a problem," she announced, activating a holographic display with one of her lower arms while her upper arms typed rapidly on multiple interfaces. "I've intercepted communications that concern us both." The hologram showed encrypted messages flowing between various points in space. James had learned to read the Stellar Empire's military grid over the past weeks, and something about the pattern seemed wrong. "These transmission paths," he said, pointing. "They're avoiding the main communication hubs." "Precisely." Nova's eyes glowed brighter, a sign of intense focus. "Someone is planning something, and they're trying to hide it from both Earth and Empire authorities." James moved closer to the display, studying the data. "Can you decrypt any of it?" "Only fragments. But I found this." She brought up a partial message that made James's blood run cold. "Marriage must not proceed. Destabilize both. Perfect opportunity for." "Someone's planning to use our wedding as a trigger for something bigger," James realized. "But who would benefit from damaging both Earth and Empire relations?" Nova's scales shifted in a pattern he'd learned meant she was deeply troubled. "The Border Worlds Coalition. They've always resented being caught between Earth and Empire space. If our alliance fails, they could play us against each other," James finished. "Classic divide and conquer." They worked through the night, James applying his diplomatic knowledge while Nova used her military expertise. Their different perspectives started revealing patterns they might have missed individually. "Look here," James pointed to a series of trade reports. "These border world ports have been stockpiling weapons while publicly reducing their military budgets." Nova's hands moved across multiple screens, "and my fleet reports show increased activity in supposedly abandoned sectors. They're gathering forces. But they're not just planning military action," James added, pulling up diplomatic records. "See these personnel changes. They're positioning their people in key diplomatic posts." "A multi-pronged attack," Nova nodded approvingly. "Military and political. They're smarter than I gave them credit for." James watched her analyze the tactical data, realizing how much he'd come to admire her strategic mind. She wasn't just the fearsome admiral anymore. She was a brilliant tactician who used her reputation for violence to maintain peace when possible. "We need to stop them," he said, "but without letting them know we've discovered their plan." Nova's eyes gleamed. "I have an idea, but it will require both our skills. Your diplomacy and my strategy." They spent the next hours crafting their counterplan. James would use his diplomatic channels to arrange a series of trade negotiations, innocent on the surface but positioned to disrupt the coalition's supply lines. Meanwhile, Nova would redeploy her fleets in what appeared to be routine exercises, but would actually cut off their hidden movement corridors. "It's elegant," James admitted, reviewing their plan. "No direct confrontation, no accusations they can deny. We just quietly dismantle their ability to act. Like a game of chess, as your people call it," Nova said, "moving pieces into position without revealing your true strategy." James smiled. "You've been studying Earth games. I find them interesting. Your species creates such intricate ways to practice warfare without bloodshed." As they finalized their countermeasures, James realized something important. You know, this is the first time we've worked together as true partners. Not as admiral and diplomat, not as intended mates, just us. Nova was quiet for a moment, her scales shifting in a pattern he hadn't seen before. In my centuries of command, I've never had someone I could plan with like this. Someone who sees different angles, who thinks in ways I don't. Is that a good thing? It is. She searched for the word. Refreshing. Like making eye contact across a crowded room. James laughed. That worked out better than expected, didn't it? Nova's forearms moved in her gesture of affection, but this time it seemed more natural, less practiced. Perhaps the universe knew what it was doing after all. Together, they turned back to their work, human and alien, diplomat and warrior, each bringing their own strengths to face the challenges ahead. And somewhere in the process of saving their people's alliance, they found they had built something neither had expected. A true partnership. The grand ceremonial hall of the Eternal Dawn had been transformed. Ancient stellar empire battle banners hung alongside elegant earth decorations. The massive space somehow managed to blend the military precision of Nova's culture with the warm celebration style of human weddings. James stood at the ceremony point, wearing a unique outfit that combined his diplomatic dress uniform with traditional Empire armor plates. The armor had been specially crafted to fit his human frame, gleaming with the same copper tones as Nova's natural scales. The assembled crowd was unlike any gathering in history. One side held the Empire's highest military command, their metallic scales creating a sea of shifting colors. The other side contained Earth's diplomatic corps and James's family, looking remarkably composed despite sitting next to beings who could bench press a shuttle. The ceremonial drums began their rhythm, a carefully choreographed combination of Earth wedding march and Empire battle drums. James took a deep breath, and then he saw her. Admiral Nova entered the hall in her full ceremonial regalia. Her four arms carried traditional weapons, but they'd been modified to include Earth symbols. Her armor gleamed with both military medals and delicate decorative elements that caught the light like stars. But it was her eyes that held James's attention, those nebulous world eyes that had started this whole journey with one accidental glance. She moved with characteristic precision, but James could see the subtle signs of emotion in her scale patterns. They'd learned to read each other so well over the past month. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of cultural fusion. They began with the traditional Empire combat challenge, but instead of fighting, they demonstrated their unity through a coordinated strategic display. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, Nova's four arms and James's two moving in harmony to show battle formations that flowed into dance-like patterns. When it came time for the vows, they'd created their own unique blend. Nova began with the traditional Empire roar of commitment, the sound making the crystal decorations sing. James responded not with an attempt to match her roar, but with words in her native language that he'd spent weeks practicing. Through battles and peace, through stars and storms, my strategy is yours, my strength is yours, my heart is yours. Nova's scales rippled with emotion as she spoke her human vows, her accent giving the English words a musical quality. In all the vastness of space, my eyes found yours, and my soul chose true. The gathering of witnesses, human and alien alike, watched in amazed silence as the most feared commander in 3 sectors and a human diplomat completed their union with both the Empire's traditional binding ritual and a human kiss. The kiss had required some practice and careful attention to Nova's natural armor, but they'd made it work. As they turned to face their gathered guests, James saw tears in his mother's eyes, while Nova's military commanders tried to maintain their stern expressions despite their scales, showing clear patterns of joy. The celebration that followed set new standards for interstellar parties. Empire warriors performed traditional battle dances, while human guests taught alien diplomats the electric slide. Someone even convinced Nova to try champagne, leading to an interesting discussion about human alcohol tolerance versus Empire metabolism. Later, as the celebration continued around them, James and Nova stood at their favorite spot on the observation deck, watching the stars. "Your heart rate is elevated," Nova noted, using all four arms to hold him in a gentle embrace they'd figured out through careful trial and error. "Happy emotions this time," James assured her, "though I still can't believe how this all started." With one look, Nova's eyes swirled with amusement. The simplest battle strategy sometimes yields the greatest victory. "Is that what it was? A battle strategy?" "No," she said softly. "You were the piece I never knew I sought." As they stood there, Earth and Empire representatives mingled behind them, former enemies becoming friends, their union already building bridges they'd hoped for but hadn't expected so soon. "Ready to face whatever comes next?" James asked. Nova's scales shifted in the pattern that was uniquely his. "Together," she said, "we can face anything. After all, I have the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal now." "Oh, what's that?" "A diplomatic husband who isn't afraid to look me in the eyes." And as they shared another carefully choreographed kiss against the backdrop of stars, both knew that this wasn't just their story anymore. It was the beginning of a new chapter for both their peoples, born from one accidental glance and growing into something neither world could have imagined.